Since changing the name of the Eclectic Americana Friday morning drive time radio show on January 20th, 1989 to the Bushwhackers Breakfast Club, the DJs in the collective have strived to entertain and inform our listeners. Airing from 6 to 9 a.m. Pacific at KZSC 88.1 FM in Santa Cruz, California, the Bushwhackers usually have 2 interviews a week, each airing for about half an hour. We're not afraid to ask questions or admit that we don't know something, and we don't mind taking deep dives or following a tangent as we get into how sausage is made in local, county, or state politics, or learning about things going on in our community, or discussions with artists. Our interviews are not scripted and are produced by myself, Dangerous Dan Orange. Hello, Tony.
Hello, how are you? Good morning, Dan. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Excellent, excellent.
So Tony Shafer, retired L.A. fireman, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And were you a structural fireman or a forest fireman?
We were mostly structure. I mean, I fought a lot of wildland fires, but our primary objective was structure protection.
And that was in the city of Los Angeles or the county or both?
In the city and throughout my career, that was from Santa Barbara to, I don't know, I guess I got as far as San Diego, but Santa Barbara to Orange County is probably the range that I worked in.
I got you. Well, we last spoke with you on October 22nd. It's July 22nd, so it's it's been a while, and that was right after the Estrada fire, which was a controlled burn that jumped its line and caused a little bit of hand-wringing, given the fires that we've had. But that was back in October. And so where do we want to start? Because, I mean, there was a controlled burn in New Mexico that has turned into an absolutely ginormous fire. But that controlled burn was back in January, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's correct. I think that was the Hermit Ridge Fire, or the Hermit Fire, and which turned into the Cass Fire. Right? Yeah, I mean it's burned about 300,000 acres. I mean it's a big fire.
So how can a fire, a prescribed burn in January, generate a ginormous fire in, I don't know when it started up again, May, June, but it was months later. How does that happen?
Well, they just burn in the underbrush. They burn in the duff, and sometimes even underground. And then the wind kicks up and starts it off again. And most of these areas are pretty rural. But the real issue is that we're sort of on the horns of a dilemma right now. Nobody has a real policy for how to handle these events, and the Forest Service over the last several decades or the last decade anyway, has been trying to develop a plan where they can prescribe burn in areas that are safe relative to structures. And so we have these prescribed burns, or they anticipate having prescribed burns, and occasionally they get away. I mean, that's just the fact of life. We haven't affected a good control method for these things and a good monitoring method. And at the same time, they're trying to develop policies where they can identify areas where they can let fires burn, and they just monitor them in order to, because the fuel loading problem within the national forests, or just within the nation as a whole, is tremendous, and it's causing these events all over the country. And as we can see in Europe, they're seeing the same thing in Europe, and Australia has a similar problem. And the fact is the fuel loads are just too extreme, too high, and so when fires get started, they just turn into these infernos. And consequently, there's a little window of opportunity in there for them to have these prescribed burns. And sometimes that window closes and they get out of hand. But sort of along with that policy, and the thing that's really causing some of the real issues is this: they now have a policy, they have a policy after evaluating the watersheds where they just monitor a fire if, let's say, it starts by a lightning strike. So they just monitor it. And that's what's caused this most recent fire in New Mexico is, from what I understand, is that the monitoring aspect of it, things got out of control.
I see. Because if the problem is extreme fuel loads, is short of mobilizing the entire population to take out every branch and twig, the only option is prescribed burn. But you're saying what happened in New Mexico is the monitoring somehow, they weren't watching, even though, I mean, if it's months later, I admit that if, I'd been out there, I probably wouldn't have thought that a burn could reignite months, multiple months, 3 or 4 months after the burn.
They're burning underground, and I mean and in a fire that's around an urban area, we will spend days, weeks going up on the hillside, putting out old logs or roots that are underground that are burning and everything, and we'll spend weeks monitoring that in the city of Los Angeles and even in the county of Los Angeles. So that aspect of it is not unusual. The real problem, I'll tell you quite frankly, is that our current situation is the result of 100 years of bad policy of not controlling the fuel load. And then we have a complete lack of effective strategy for protection of structures. That's the basic bottom line. And the conflict between the objectives of, let's say, the federal forestry and the need to protect structures, there's a real issue. I mean, the federal forestry actually hates to protect structures, and they have lines in their documents that tell their people that they're not to enter into buildings and are not to go onto roofs. And the high point of structure protection is big lines in the street, 2 lines inside, and ladders to the roof. And if you have a policy that actually eliminates that, we're in trouble.
So say that,
and effectively, we don't have any method to change it.
Okay, Tony, let me hit pause just for a second. Tony Shafer, retired L.A. Fireman. Say that again. If there's a structural fire, you said 2 lines on the road, so those are water lines.
Well, no, big lines in the street. You gotta have the capability. It doesn't mean that you're going to do it, but you gotta have the capability to put big lines in the street, 2 lines inside, and ladders to the roof. That's structure firefighting in an urban environment. And when you have suburbs, Coffee Park is a good example. That community was a long ways from the fire front, and a structure got started probably from a spot or something like that, and they had no effective defense to protect that community. And for me, it's scandalous. And I don't think that the public knows or thinks that this is a problem, but it is. And I have a database of about 50,000 structures that have been lost in the state of California in the last, 9 or 10 years, something like that. And so and it's not just California's problem. I mean, look what happened in Colorado with the Marshall Fire. Wiped out 1,150 homes in a suburban tract basically, outside of Boulder. And so far, we have no strategies in order to combat that. And there's things that we could do, but we can't do it the day the fire starts. We gotta preload so many policies and get so many ducks in a row that we just have to do it if we're going to mitigate these problems. But fortunately or unfortunately, we can't seem to get anybody too interested in doing it. I mean, we get throughout the country there's lip service, but structure firefighting relative to wildland fire is not a high priority for most of these agencies.
Okay, let's dig down into that, Tony Shafer, retired LA fireman. You say, I hear you use these words, structural fire and structural firefighting, and then I hear you say wildland fires and wildland firefighting. Isn't firefighting? You get a firefighter, you fight a fire. It doesn't matter where it is or what it's burning. Is it not the same thing?
Well, I mean, you would think it is, but it's not really. I mean, it's like the difference between the Navy and the Marines, right? Or the Air Force. I guess a better example might be the Air Force and the Marines. I mean, yeah, you need air cover and everything, but if you're going to root out some enemy, you got to put boots on the ground and get into those spots where the enemy is. And unfortunately, we don't have that strategy relative to wildland fire. I mean, wildland fire is or the wildland side of it is made up of a bunch of guys with hoes and rakes and chainsaws, right? They're not going to do anything for a structure fire. And when you have an agency like the Federal Forestry that actually has policies in place that reprimand their personnel from trying to protect structures, then you're in trouble. I mean, and then you're in the situation where we are, where you're losing hundreds of, in some cases, thousands of structures. And the only concern appears to be for the vegetation, for the sequoias or the trees. And unfortunately, these families are sort of, I don't know, they're just the refugees along the road after these things occur.
So, Tony Shafer, if wildland firefighters are not trained to fight fires and structures, and as you say, if there are policies that actually direct them away from fighting fires and structures, and they get reprimanded for fighting fires and structures, is this all wildland firefighters, county, state, and federal, or is this mostly a federal observation? Because I'm thinking CAL FIRE. Does CAL FIRE have the same constraints? Because CAL FIRE is who mobilized to fight our CSZ fire here in the Santa Cruz Mountains a couple of years ago.
Well, and generally, no. I mean, forestry, CAL FIRE, or forestry grew out of the federal forestry. I mean, these are all children of federal forestry, basically, and a lot of these agencies and everything are, your local fire district. The only thing they want to do is protect your structure. The problem becomes when you have a fire that's not necessarily in your community, but sort of outside of your community. A lot of times your local resources will be drawn to that fire on the initial attack. Consequently, firefighters and agencies come into your community that they don't know anything about your community. All they know is that they're there for whatever purpose they're there for. A lot of times they fill the stations of the fire stations that have gone to the original dispatch, but they know nothing or very little about your community. And consequently, the control of that burn, let's say it's in the national park somewhere, that control of that burn and the supervisors of that burn are going to be probably a federal agency. I mean, in the state of California, with as much federal land as there is, it's a flip of a coin whether CAL FIRE is going to be in charge or whether the federal forestry is going to be in charge. And if the federal forestry is in charge, you're in deep trouble because you have no idea what their policies are going to be. And with CAL FIRE, I would definitely say that CAL FIRE is there to protect your structure. There's no question in my mind that that's their motivation. The problem is that throughout the state, particularly since Proposition 13, most of these companies are three-man companies, three-man engine companies. And unfortunately, a three-man engine company in a big firefight is virtually worthless. You've got to have, because that only means you got one guy, and that's pulling lines and putting the wet stuff on the red stuff, as they say. And unfortunately, that's the situation we're in. But there are steps that communities can take for their own self-protection. And that's probably the thing that we need to promote the most.
Well, before we get into that, Eric sends in a text. During the CZU fire, we had many local fire companies out there fighting the fire, but we also had CAL FIRE. So kind of, with the Uvalde shooting on my mind, was CAL FIRE the incident commander, and with their, legacy of coming out of federal forest fighting, did that mean that there was less attention paid to structures? Or was each company acting as its own, incident commander, if you will?
No, I'm not particularly sure of the command structure in that fire. I'm not aware of it at all, matter of fact. But the issue becomes, if your local guys are on the initial dispatch, and then you get fill-in companies that are CAL FIRE or whoever they are. They could be from the city of Los Angeles, for that matter, depending upon the incident. And the state of California has a great program to move urban companies to these outlying areas for these major events. But what happens is that you get companies in that are not aware of the area. And usually they're organized into what they call strike teams. And that strike team has probably got a battalion chief or some chief officer that's in charge of those 5 companies. And if he doesn't really have a handle on the area, it's difficult to get companies out into these outlying areas along the edge of where the fire perimeter is. And so consequently, there's a reluctancy to send companies or to place engine companies into situations where they're going to be at risk. And this is a problem. And sometimes I think that the real issue is that, if we just have to start organizing the communities, if nothing else, in order to protect themselves. And a lot of that has to do with mitigation, has to do with putting pressure on their policymakers, whether it's the county supervisors or the fire district heads. The communities need to preload this system so that when these events occur, certain issues are taken care of before the event. Because most of these fires that get into the communities, you have dozens of failures along the way that lead to coffee parks, paradise, those kinds of things. And we just can't wait until the fire occurs in order to make plans for it.
So
and that's kind of where we are today.
So touch wood, we don't have anything major burning in our area. If you're just joining us, folks, we're talking with Tony Shafer, retired LA fireman. We're talking about fires, and now we're going to dig into strategies on what we can do now when things aren't burning to help us be kind of better prepared as a community, when a fire does hit. So, Tony, the firefighting in our area, other than CAL FIRE, we have local fire districts, we have the county board of supervisors, and we have city councils. Okay, what are the strategies that people listening to us here can do, and what are the questions they can ask of these entities to help us be better prepared for when a fire occurs?
Well, there's and what we have to do is we have to look back. I mean, I look back on where the failures occur during the events. And first thing is that they're turning the power off, right? So what does that do? First thing it does is, relative to the people that are directly affected by the fire front, is that it turns off all your signaling devices at your street intersections. So an evacuation that might be, 20 minutes turns into an hour and 20 minutes or 2 hours and 20 minutes because you're stuck on the road in traffic. And 90% of all deaths in wildland fires, whether it be in Australia, Europe, or the United States, happen during evacuation. People get clogged up. I mean, you look at the 85 deaths in Paradise. I don't know the exact number, but probably 80 to 90% of everyone that died during that fire died during evacuation. And evacuation plans are not well thought out. The road surfaces are not in such a way that they can get out. There's pinch points within the evacuation route where fire is going to stop people, and people are going to be jammed up on that evacuation route, and they're going to burn to death in their cars along that evacuation route. I mean, 130 people died in one location in Australia a few years ago. And I mean, it's just one of the facts of life. So the first thing is that when they turn that power off, you lose your traffic control system totally. The other issue is that when they turn the power off, more than likely in most of these mountain-type communities, you lose your water system too. And if you lose your water system because the power is out or it goes dry, you get yourself in a situation where most structure firefighters are either going to pull out as soon as they lose water, or they're not going to be effective, one or the other. Because once these structures start, it takes hundreds, if not thousands, of gallons of water in order to get it knocked down. And so consequently, if you start with having backup power for your signals, your light signals on your streets, on your evacuation routes, you have backup power for your water, that's probably a pretty good start. But that's only the beginning, because if the power doesn't go out, these systems, these water systems particularly, they fail anyway, because just the policies of your local water district is such that they don't keep those tanks on those hillsides filled to the brim all the time.
Right. So you were telling me, Tony, that there are questions that people should be asking of their fire district, their county supervisors, and city councils. And one of the questions was, are you pre-filling all of the tanks during the dry season so that we have all of the water that we could possibly have just in case? That's question number one. Well, I'm sorry, that was question number two. Question number one, do we have backup power for our signaling devices and our water systems? That was one. Two, are you pre-filling the tanks so that we have all the water we possibly can have in storage just in case? What are a couple other questions?
Well, the other question has to do with the fire protection itself. Is your district or your county prepared for this event? The first thing is during high hazard days, and usually most of these things only need to be implemented during the high hazard days, because that's when 90% of these events occur. But what we need to be asking these districts and these county supervisors is, are we in a position where we're pre-deploying companies to these outlying areas where the risk is the highest during high hazard days? So you need to pre-deploy companies where you expect to have issues, and you need to pre-deploy as soon as that fire starts in the hinterlands, 20 miles or 15 miles from your community. And so that's the first issue. The second issue is during high hazard days, are you upstaffing? Are you going up to 4-man engine companies as opposed to what you're normally running as 3-man engine companies? And again, 3-man engine companies on these fires particularly for structure protection, are worthless. We saw in Laguna just a couple months ago where 3-man engine companies blocked the street with equipment but didn't have enough men in order to get the fire under control. And so it's those kinds of things that, down to the point, the county supervisors are probably the ones that are most responsible for this. The county supervisors provide the budget for these fire districts, and if the fire district doesn't have enough money to maintain their reserve apparatus, then you don't have enough companies when the event occurs. If you have a good reserve apparatus fleet, if you have a 30 engine company district or a 100 engine company district, you need to have at least half of your resources available in reserve and loaded in order to be able to hold the off-going shift or the oncoming shift the next day when this event is in operation. And so consequently, in a lot of these things, it becomes a budget issue. In the county of Los Angeles, if you can believe this, in the Woolsey fire, which I don't know, burned 12 or 1,300 homes, you had only 3 reserve apparatus in the entire county of Los Angeles. I mean, it's scandalous. But again, it's a budget issue, right? This is an easy budget item that we can blue pencil, and 99% of the time you can get away with it. But that 1% of the time that you don't or you can't, it's devastating.
So Tony Shafer, retired LA fireman. We got the KPFA Morning News coming up here in just a couple of minutes. This is KZSE Santa Cruz, the Bushwhackers Breakfast Club. Scott sends in a text, OMG, maybe people should move into town. Yeah, as if we've got enough housing in town to handle everybody. I mean, it's a reality. People are going to be living in the urban wildland interface, the WUI or whatever it is. But, Tony, let me run down the questions people should be asking of their fire district, the county supervisors, and the city council. 1, do we have backup power for our signaling systems and water? 2, are we pre-filling all the tanks so that we've got all the water up there that we can possibly have just in case? 3, are we pre-deploying teams to high-risk areas? And that means sending them out there, as you said, into the hinterland. And 4, are you upstaffing on high-risk days? And 5, have we budgeted for the reserve fleet that we need? These are the questions people should be asking. Tony Shafer, great having you doing a deep dive into fire. Thank you so much for calling us here on KCSC and the Bushwhackers Breakfast Club. Unfortunately, we got to go, but we're going to continue this conversation.
I hope so.
Be well.
Have a good day.
Be safe. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to a podcast from an interview on the Bushwhackers Breakfast Club on KZSC 88.1 FM in Santa Cruz, California. This interview has been produced by myself, Dangerous Dan Orange. KZSC is a student-run college and community non-commercial educational radio station broadcasting from the UC Santa Cruz campus. You can stream KZSC online at kzsc.org. Thanks for listening.